I'd like to add my thanks to the organisers and funders of the conference. I'm not a Whistler scholar really, and I'm very conscious of the honour of being asked to speak at a conference such as this one, particularly since it's in the honour of Margaret MacDonald. It's a great privilege. I will try. I am British. It means if you can hear me, I'm being impolite. Okay. There is a funnel of open and receding colour, flat and almost desolate in its presiding undifferentiation of river and sky. On the left of the expanse of water, the outlines of the roofs and chimneys and the stacks and mounds of the piled heaps of detritus clustered on the Battersea shore reflect their forms down into the unmoving river. On the right, the lights and low buildings of Cremorne Gardens echo and amplify the effect, mobilizing constellations of lights which strike down in reflected verticals against the water. Nearer to the picture plane, space is defined by a low Thames barge and the ghostly figure who tends it and who is just about visible, both of them almost vanishing away into the ambient colour. At the very front of the image, two plant stalks obtrude and rhyme with the human movement of the bargeman to ease our way into the painting. To the far right, Whistler has added the butterfly signature. This is Nocturne, blue and silver, of 1872 in Tate. According to the 1994 Tate Whistler catalogue, the artist painted it over the rubbed-down remains of an earlier work, which represented 4 robed figures on the seashore, and was perhaps related to the 6 projects of 1868. Possibly the presence of those figures and their watery context influenced their 3 analogues in the bargeman, the wind-blown stems, and the butterfly cartouche, when Whistler came to repaint the canvas in the form that we know it today. These elements of the Nocturne, like the waterside figures who populate Whistler's earlier paintings, are meditative, looking into the picture space and over the broad expanse of the water that reflects and amplifies their inwardness. The Nocturne blue and silver is a London scene, of course. Along with his compatriot Henry James, Whistler represents the great moment of 19th century American expatriation to Europe, and like James, he seems to have decided that London is on the whole the most possible form of life. That's a quote from James from the early 1880s. Despite its manifest disadvantages, what James called the insupportable character of the city, and we've heard some of this before, and I think it's very apposite. James went on about insupportability. The fogs, the smoke, the dirt, the darkness, the wet, the horrible numerosity of society. London in the 1860s was the principal global cultural centre and powerhouse, and somehow for Whistler, as later for James, a distillation of modern experience, more concentrated and potent even than Paris, so that London's dank fogs and dripping darknesses, signs of its characteristically shabby urban gloom, came to seem evocative of an intoxicating and mysterious significance which could not be equalled elsewhere. The points of reference for the London Nocturnes have appropriately enough often seemed to be the pungently English 19th century meditation on the great river and its famously polluted and industrialized condition, graphically described in the novels of Charles Dickens and the social reportage of Henry Mayhew, as in the journalism and print culture of the time. Dickens' filthy Thames, Mayhew's mudlarks, wading in the mud to the ankle and sometimes to the knee, and the miasma of the Thames' great stink in the 1850s have been taken to throw into illuminating contrast Whistler's adroit veiling and transformation of these urban scenes into palaces of the night and fairyland. The fogs and miasma of the London scene become, in Whistler's hands, the vehicles of a subject outside anecdotal interest and of artistic interest alone, as of course he said. In this paper, I want to take a somewhat contrasting view and try and look at the ways in which American nature and its painting finds its way into the texture of Whistler's urban scenes as they appear in the London Nocturnes. And I should say that this is part of a project, very slow-moving project, which is on the persistence of the mid-19th century American landscape tradition into the painting of the cities that emerged in this country from the 1880s onwards and into the 20th century. What does it mean to think that the most powerful tradition of visual representation that was available to American painters who wished to depict the new cities, to think that powerful inheritance was the inheritance of the landscape tradition? And it seems to me that in telling that story, or seeking to tell that story, Whistler must be a key moment. The compositional strategies of the Nocturnes have often been related to Japanese and French visual examples, but I propose that these urban pictures also depend in fundamental ways on representational conventions evolved to deal with the depiction of American nature. These conventions refer to and are coloured by the powerful influence of that mid-century landscape tradition, which amounted to the most authoritative visual attempt to describe the physical and experiential world which Americans had made out of the discovered continent. Why this should be and what it implies are searching questions in their own right. But in Whistler's Nocturnes, the meanings of the American wilderness, transformed and managed in relation to national growth in the heritage bequeathed by the Hudson River School, power what George Moore called the Nocturne's evocations of the blue, transparent darknesses which are half of the world's life, in the atmosphere and spaces of a nighttime city, and daytime fog-bound city, half a world away from the United States. Nikolai Tchaikovsky and Charles Brock, who've examined the question of Whistler's Americanness, have concluded that, although it was anchored deeply into his self-presentation and personal tastes, this shadowy and mysterious attribute was at no time an artistic Americanness. In particular, in a very interesting essay, they bring out the contrast between the fervent artistic nationalism of American art in the 1850s, at a time when Whistler left the country at the age of 21, never to return. I'm just showing you, I think, familiar examples of that tradition. And the fact that Whistler's conduct, self-presentation, and painting all appeared to repudiate, they write, the national responsibilities that most serious American artists readily accepted during the 50s. American landscape at the mid-century was painting that embraced and expressed the predominant nationalism of its society and the stress on moral virtue of its emergent middle classes. And it often seems to have thought of those two things as identical and as ideally expressed through a style of landscape painting in a high and independent style, keyed to America's native resources, to cite Asher B. Duran's words in the 1855 Letters on Landscape Painting. Whistler's programmatic elevation of painting, that he put it in the 10 o'clock lecture, was selfishly occupied with her own perfection only, having no desire to teach, seeking and finding the beautiful in all conditions and in all times, might therefore seem a direct challenge to such remembered American artistic moralism. Indeed, to add to the evidence Tchaikovsky and Brock bring forward, the 10 o'clock lecture's opening, in which Whistler, he says, with great hesitation and misgiving, appears in the character of the preacher, can in this context also be read as a deliberate mockery or repudiation of the whole system. If so, by the 1880s, when he spoke the words of his lecture in London, Whistler had successfully exported his revision of American artistic moralism and his influence in America was pervasive, as Tchaikovsky and Brock show. His challenge, if that is what it was in the 10 o'clock lecture, was to a style of painting that recalled his youth and the moment of his departure for Europe. Now, I'm sure that reading is, in its essences, entirely correct. Nonetheless, I think there may be other dimensions to Whistler's relationship with his native art. If he was not entirely American, Whistler was certainly not European either. No matter how long he lived in London, he continued to insist that, first of all, I am not English. Who wouldn't? He referred to the US as home shortly before he died, by which time he'd not been there for nearly 50 years, and he liked to claim that the agitated question of whether he should be considered English or American, in italics, would never be settled. However lightly and flexibly the bonds of his nationality and national traditions lay on him, they remained persistent and were not to be thrown off, even as they gradually atrophied, perhaps, into the memory of a world and a nation as it had been decades into the past. I think these things are particularly evident in the dialectic in Whistler's painting between landscape, that central subject of and definition of the character of mid-century, mid-19th century American art, and the city. For it was not only that moralism that Whistler changed and obscured, he also transformed the major subject of this alteration from the landscape to its urban double, during decades when the face of American society was changing as it rapidly urbanized, even if it was doing that without the benefit of Whistler. In consequence, the means of approaching and defining the city in Whistler's paintings owes, I think, an unexpected debt to this apparently, and indeed really, I suppose, repudiated artistic past. One way into this subject is to observe a naive way, you might think, is to observe those compositional devices that Whistler shares with, and in fact owes to, the American landscape tradition. The observing figures, for instance, who appear in many paintings, such as this one, which Whistler made in 1865, not very long before he made the first Nocturnes. Such figures and their contemplative and pensive reflection, meditatively directed towards the sea or some other body of water, are often said to be indicative of important currents in American culture in the mid-19th century. I'm sorry, currents is a very bad pun in that sentence. This is another picture, which is also in Boston. Meditation by the Sea, anonymous, dated to the 1860s, a piece of folk art in the sense that it's by an amateur, almost certainly, that certainly would not have been known to Whistler. But it shares this interest and is often cited as an example of the widespread dissemination of some of the most prominent tropes of American culture around the mid-19th century. Hudson River School paintings, such as Frederick Edwin Church's 1853 Mount Katahdin in New Haven, often feature these bodies of water as central compositional devices in the mid-ground. And in many such landscapes, there's also an observing subject whose contemplation, like that of the farm boy in the church, and the farm boy is leaning against the right-handmost tree and can be observed there and gazing out over the scene. Like that of the farm boy in the church, or the figure in Meditation by the Sea, is evoked or concentrated by the intermediary reflective surface provided by the water. Focusing on these liquid surfaces in the prospect, the observers in such paintings tend to glide over them and into reverie on the future. The effect is often to position paintings of this time in a poised relationship between settlement and the untouched world beyond, as Tim Barringer, in fact, has said. Those are his words. And many commentators have rightly seen Church's painting as profoundly meditative and evocative. I think those are Tim's words as well. Probably the whole thing is Tim's words, actually. And the impulse of the picture is driven by the imagining of future conquest of the wilderness, So you've got a sort of prolepsis here, that the farm boy stands for the viewer who looks forward and sees Maine not as it was when Church painted this image, but as it will be when cultivated and settled in the future. And the midground describes that cultivation and civilization of the wilderness. The dialectic between nature and settlement is given a strong reading in Hudson River images. The argument of the visual world they create arrogates the wilderness to the ideal of settlement and civil order. The world is remade as a function of the settled human mandate, and the contemplative self is depicted speculatively mulling over these glowing future prospects. Church's farm boy contemplates the state of Maine once human labour has done its work in transforming it from wilderness to the ordered landscape of mills, factories and roads his mind envisages and the painting shows us before its realization. In this context, it seems newly significant that Whistler's first nocturnes grew out of earlier images that featured figures by the sea during his rather mysterious trip to Valparaiso in Chile in 1866. Latin America had only shortly before been the scene of central images in the Hudson River tradition, notably the church, which had travelled to London for exhibition in 1859. The dramatic and awe-inspiring scenery of the Andes provided key images of America for Church's painting and its audiences. Whatever the real motivations behind Whistler's trip, and there are no doubt people in the audience who know them, which brought him nearer to the US than he had been since his departure, the conjunction of the continent, the ocean, and his American and European artistic inheritances provoked a development in his work. The nature of this change can be examined further by looking closer at the compositional reminders of the Hudson River tradition in the Nocturnes. Asher B. Durand's Early Morning at Cold Spring, 1850, in New Jersey, features a more central contemplative figure, looking out onto a settlement in upper New York State, much visited by the Hudson River painters. Whistler's Nocturnes make use of such compositional tropes. The Nocturne, blue and silver, Chelsea and Tate, features the stretch of water over which the standing figure looks to the massed forms of development beyond. And even more than Durand's Watcher, who seems to be dissolving into identity with the colours of the glittering light, Whistler's is a liquid witness, melting, blending and softening, fading away into the tones of the surrounding scene. A process which Arthur Symonds thought amounted to the spiritualizing of paint itself. The usual reading of Whistler's comments on the Nocturnes takes his own emphasis on transformation as their lead. In a famous passage, which you'll have to forgive me quoting in part, in the 10 o'clock lecture, Whistler puts this case forward. And then the evening mist clothes the riverside with poetry, he wrote, as with a veil, and the poor buildings lose themselves in the dim sky, and the tall chimneys become campanili, and the warehouses are palaces in the night. And the whole city hangs in the heavens, and fairyland is before us. Then nature, who for once has sung in tune, sings her exquisite song to the artist alone. However, reference to the American inheritance that I think is there in these images suggests that Whistler's transformation of the urban cityscape, the industrial river, and its polluted waters derives much of its power from the trope that allowed Hudson River landscapists to accommodate the brutal otherness of the wilderness to an imaginary in which the settled human world could be signalled through the adapted images of that nature. Church's Mount Katahdin, surrounded by pale clouds and seductive colours, lets its otherness stand for the success of settlement in accommodating the most resistant elements of the wilderness to a human scale and to human desire. Whistler's industrial Thames and the city skyline of factories and illumination performs a similar operation, allowing the starkness of the urban environment to serve as a confirmation of the reality of his imaginative seizure of this strange and other world. Notice in the passage I read out, Whistler's strictures on nature, which has, for once, sung in tune, under the reshaping force of the painter's imagination. The transformation here is an effect of the will and of desire. It takes the resistant occasion of the world and pushes it into an imagined accommodation to a human intention. Elsewhere in the Nocturnes, Whistler abandons the central contemplative figure. Nocturne in grey and gold, Westminster Bridge in Glasgow, and the Harvard Nocturne in blue and silver, for example, lack figures, although the latter originally featured a barge, subsequently painted over. But we can think perhaps of the signature cartouche or the Japanese device of the branches at the bottom of the picture plane as substitutes for the onlooker gazing out and across the water. These pictures position the spectators as the watching figure and offer the transformation of the industrial riverscape and its buildings as the reward for their observation. The Nocturnes, famously derived from Whistler's memory exercises, are also preoccupied with time in a different way to the proleptic dreaming of Hudson River paintings like the Mount Katahdin. And here I think the sorts of things that I want to say in the paper begin to tie in very closely with what Caroline Alscott talked to us about yesterday afternoon, and with strong elements that I've heard Anna Groetzner-Robbins and Imogen Hart today both signal in relation to their own papers. Memory positions them in an immediate but retreating past. Pictures like this. The Nocturnes, sorry. In the Nocturnes, let's start the sentence again. In the Nocturnes, memory positions the scenes in an immediate but retreating past and asks them to recover a scene which has now vanished. When Church painted Maine in 1853, he imagined its future, or he allowed his farm boy to imagine its future, but for Whistler, in the Detroit Nocturne in black and gold, when the watcher stands and looks forward at the starburst of the fireworks above Cremorne Pleasure Gardens, she gazes out at a world that consists of, well, what exactly? Because I think my formulation has probably been superseded by, or needs to be rethought in the context of what Caroline was saying in particular about duration, but consists of a witnessed moment of present time which is held and stretched for examination. We might read this as a refusal of the landscape tradition's obsessive claims for futurity. The anticipated destinies in paintings such as the Church or Cropsey's American Harvesting, which I showed you earlier, are what connect the mid-century conventions to the political and to the moralistic nationalism of the time. By substituting a remembered present for these expectant dreams, and by veiling their original clarity in the fogs and mists of a distant island, Whistler's Nocturnes shift the gears of time in landscape towards the immediacy of the city. Elsewhere in the Nocturnes, this interest in the present begins to animate the static protagonists of the landscape tradition and send them scuttling into an experienced world of labour. In these pictures, the central figure ceases only to watch and becomes more active and more disturbing. In this lithograph, the figure is bowed at his... I hope it is a lithograph. The figure is bowed at his toil. In Nocturne, blue and gold, in Tate, the figure is again labouring and takes on the hunched, abject quality of the moving figures inching along the bridge above. His awkward, knock-kneed stance and bowed head and shoulders convey a sense of the physical demands tending to the boat imposes. Positioned against the reflective surface of the river, this figure amounts to a negative, a sign or indication of the fantasy that an idle farm boy or comfortable spectator of the fruits of labour embody. Whistler's protagonist no longer casts a pensive glance over the reflective body of water, but looks down and away towards present labour and away from future promise. These figures reflect to some degree the fault lines within the Hudson River School's projected belief in successful human endeavour. Whistler's London is a different place to the one evoked by Dickens in his novels. Whereas Dickens contrasts in Little Dorrit of 1857 the bright association and variety of beautiful form in the country with the city's foul, stale smells and sickly, lukewarm, dirt-stained, wretched urban scene, that view of the matter is made to look different in Whistler's evocation of the transformation of London's dirt-encrusted industrial environment as an altered state, a fantasy of palaces and campanile. This owes something of its potency to the traditions of mid-19th century American landscape. The transformation of the wilderness of American nature into the sign and symbol of the civilizing power of settlement stands behind Whistler's transformation of a city on an island off the coast of a distant continent. London's status and centrality as a cultural force which attracted Whistler's compatriot Henry James as it did Whistler himself, its role as civilizing sign, and the dirt and squalor, the foul and wretched qualities of the scene are made over into the sign of the artist's power and authority through Whistler's manipulation, specifically, I think, in part, of his American tradition. But at the same time, Whistler's reworking of this tradition amounts to a repudiation of that central tenet of the landscape tradition that casts aspiration forward and depicts its ultimate realization as if it had already arrived. Thank you.